All right, another episode of the wonderful Profit Engines with our Practice Bloom stint towards the aesthetics. Not all the time do we do aesthetics, but of course we talk to a lot of people who are in the aesthetics market. I've got Erica on with me. Say hi, Erica.
Hi.
Right. So we do this once a month and go through some diagnostics. This one happens to be very specific towards one of the things that we get asked all the time, which is, how much money am I going to make? Kind of important when you start to do marketing to figure this out. Now, this is a pretty detailed, I guess you could call it matrix. That's what we've named it. But I think at the end of the day, what it really is a profitability projector. So what we've done here is we've broken the typical procedures down for a med spa, aesthetics, or cosmetic surgeon, dermatology. Basically a lot of the stuff that relates to that business. Let's just call it in general medical aesthetics. And I think the challenge with a lot of our clients when we start speaking with them is return on investment. And that's the number one driver of the reason why people are in the business, is because the procedure can turn a pretty good investment return if you do the right things in the right order. So what we're going to talk about is a couple of these, and I'll invite you, if you want, listener or watcher, to download this particular matrix if you're so interested. We will provide the link to that if you are looking to get some of this information in a quick glance and make some maybe better decisions on how to go about maybe putting package pricing together so that you're always going to have a decent return on your investment and your efforts. But right now, let's just go through it and walk down the lane, and we'll talk. Erica and I will talk about this. We'll take the first one, which is a common procedure, which is Botox, and I'm just going to highlight as we move down the lane here, so we can see Botox. Initially, we see a lot of the first sessions coming in at $299-ish or whatever. So we put $300. That's maybe one session. Maybe we can talk about that real quick because it's important for people to understand. So Botox obviously has multiple areas that typically someone doesn't always come in for one area. It's maybe a 3 area. So just talk a little bit about that. And the reason why I'm putting the follow-up here is that initial and follow-up can be done in synchronicity, meaning that you could book it all in one shot, or you could book one and then work for the other. But let's talk a little bit about the difference between $300 and $750 here. You could maybe chime in a little bit, Erica.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we run these types of ads, we are going to draw in leads at whatever the promotion is. Many times we run $10 per unit. That's the standard lead gen ad that many clients run for new patients. There is a certain proportion of these leads that are going to come in and only get 30 units of Botox on their first treatment, which would equal $300. Now, if we have a great injector, a good sales team, we've nurtured the lead well, many times they'll get more than 30 units, or they may even upsell into fillers. And that's how we're getting into the higher tickets of $750 and even beyond, actually.
Right. So typical person, maybe they come in for frown lines or whatever, go do one session, and then the common thing would be to upsell them to 3 sessions on in total as a sort of a bargain, right? So it's $300 for the first session and then $750 for 3 altogether. So you're getting a discounted rate. And of course, I prefer not to go into the per unit because I'd rather do per area, because then the units become inconsequential. It's just the per area. So, that's why we always try and suggest to do $100 off or $50 off or whatever the number comes out that makes sense for your practice, but doing it areas as opposed to units makes it a little easier on trying to gain some profitability, because obviously some areas are not going to be as dense, obviously, as others. But let's just say you did frown areas, maybe above the temple, whatever. Pick 3 spots, chin, who knows, right? You pick 3 spots and you say, let's do the whole thing, and now you know.
Yeah, the average area is 20 to 25 units.
Right, exactly. So at the end of the day, now we have an initial where someone comes in, and then we're hoping to get a follow-up. And we base this on just reality, right? Because you've run a med spa, Erica, you kind of know how this works from a physical layer for doing this for 10 years. I've been doing the marketing for 10 years. We kind of come to the conclusion that a good, solid practice should be getting a return of investment about $750 on a Botox patient if they're upselling and being consistent with sort of the marketing, which means that they contact the patient should come in, and then even if they don't get it on the first time, that they're able to contact the patient a secondary time, or at least get the patient to follow through on some other service. And the reason why we're trying to make this specific is that when we get down the line here, you'll understand why you need to do this, not just because it's mechanically built this way. But let's get into the next thing, which is now we have cost per lead. So what I'm always interested in is people don't understand that cost per lead in Facebook is pretty cheap. It's $10 on average to get a lead from Facebook. The only thing is we have a delta here. And what I mean by a delta is that not every lead turns into a sale. Not every lead turns into a person walking through the door. About 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 will then turn into a lead that will walk through the door. So our CPB here is our cost per booking. So booking, you're going to end up about $67 on average for someone to literally walk through the door of your practice to get serviced. Now, one thing you have to consider is how well do you close? So they may walk through the door and they may be excited and they like the offer, but maybe they don't always take. On average, we see about a 70% take rate. So the closing percentage, CP, is 70% of those people who've walked through the door. So let's do the math. $10 per lead, 1 out of roughly, we'll do 15% here, which is either 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7, which comes to the middle of that, which is basically 1/7. So we end up with 67 for a cost per booking. Then 70% of those people who come through as booked patients will then end up as procedures or actual done cash register ringing sales. So that gives your cost per acquisition, which is the thing you need to know in this business, of $113 per acquired patient for a Botox lead. So if you looked at the dichotomy of this, which is 113 versus your $300 typical cash and register versus 113 for your cost to acquire the customer, your initial ROI is 2.6%, which leaves you with $187 of profit. Now, that being said, this is why we say you must sell multiple packages, because $187 is not going to make you a wealthy practitioner. It will make you solvent, but it will not make you to the next layer. Now, if you went and had the follow-up secondary procedures, we'd see an ROI of 637. Now your full average ROI is 6.6 times your spend. That's that 113. So we really like to see a ROI of 5 or greater. In fact, if you look at this whole line of services here, you see most of them are above 5, obviously. So this is why we make sure that when you're doing this is to start to think about package pricing. So when someone comes in, you can take your ROI from 2.6 to 6.6 in this case, by just making sure that you're offering a package off of those initial offers that are in the market. And that's the most critical thing and we haven't got to cross-selling or upselling, but in Facebook, that is the complete story for a Botox lead. And this entire document has everything: laser hair, cool sculpting, microneedling, IV threadlift, M-sculpt, hormones, weight loss, veins, hydrofacial, hair restoration, tattoo, cellulite, laser lipo, fat transfer, sculpture, filler. And there's obviously more than this, but these are the common ones. And I'd like to take another example, which I think is super, super cool right now. Let's talk about thread lifts and why it's a great place to be in thread lifts.
So Threadlift is one of my favorite ads these days because the cost per leads are so low with such a great ROI. The starting price for Threadlift is $1,500 on the low end. So even if you're not upselling patients, the ROI is still amazingly good. And the majority of patients do tend to upsell and do more than one type of lift. These lifts can be eyebrow lifts, mid-face lifts, neck lifts. There's all kinds of creative things that people are doing now with threads. And, thanks to things like Instagram, they're becoming very well known and people are really excited about threads.
Right. So let's go through the numbers. Cost per lead, again, $10 a lead in Facebook. 1 out of 7 or 1 out of, let's just say 1 out of 6.7. I guess you could say we look at this and go, it's hard to put 15% because you can't really do 1 out of 6.5. But that's about what the theory is. It's what we've experienced from over time. So that 1 out of 6.5 people ends up being a cost per acquisition again of 67, the same as Botox, right? So we're in the same vein. Now, our closing percentage is going to be a little less because it's more invasive of a procedure. It's not the same as Botox. It's a little bit more intensive, and you're not going to close as many. But when you do close them, you're going to end up with a different type of ROI because of obviously the initial set of initial revenue is going to be much higher, and then the follow-through is going to be a lot higher. So we do the same math. We look at a 67 cost per booking. We close at 60% of those patients. We get an acquisition procedure cost of 106. So we're actually at now $106 per acquisition. That's a turn of 14 times return on investment of marketing, which ends up being an initial ROI of $1,300, almost $1,400, with a full set ROI at $2,800. So huge difference, right? So this is a almost a 10x difference between Botox. So that's why we talk to people when they say, hey, what would you like to do in your practice? And we look at sort of having some different goals based off of what we can obviously mine from Facebook from a marketing perspective, because there's always going to be X amount of patients in an area. Not everybody's going to do threadless. Of course, these are volume-based strategies because we know there's a lot more Botox patients than there are threadlift patients. But again, it all comes down to where do you put your efforts. And I think what we find is that a lot of people will come to us and say, hey, I want to do hydrofacial, right? Because it's an easy thing to do. But then we look at the numbers. Let's talk about this, right? So we ask a lot of people, hey, if we're going to do some ads, let's make sure they're profitable. Now, there's nothing wrong with running ads to bring people through to the practice. But you can see in this case with hydrofacial, because the cost is so low, meaning that we're actually ending up almost in a negative position, you can see an initial ROI of minus 27, right? But again, it could be a loss leader to bring the patient in to upsell them to another service. So we understand that in some cases you may need to do this, but this is the whole point. You want to do stuff that's profitable. You want to stick in the 5x or greater ROI. Then we want to do full procedures, and we want to make sure that we're getting a good turn on our investment. So let's talk quickly about cool sculpting, because I think it's one of the biggest and most profitable procedures because of the return and the flow through of consistency and volume?
So I think, Matt, if we look at Cool Sculpting, it tends to be successful time and time again because it has so much brand recognition. So because of that, cost per leads for body contouring are at $40, which is, actually quite low for body contouring, on procedures where people are spending on average, we have the initial at $12.50. Almost no one comes in and spends $12.50. I would say the average person would probably be starting with 4 cycles, which runs on average of about 2,200 even. So you have, great ROI for a body contouring procedure. Closing rate is pretty strong if the patient is a candidate because it does have so much, brand recognition. People call and, they mention Cool Sculpting, like it's a brand. And that's the thing. And the other great thing about Cool Sculpting is many practices are being given, co-op dollars from Allergan to also help offset some of these costs per leads, which is another great thing.
Right, but we still can't get away from the truth, which is that the cost per booking is going to be around $267 to bring a Cool Sculpting patient in. And of those, you're going to close 55%. So your acquisition costs are really high. It's $413, but you're getting volume because it's an easy volumetric sale. There's a lot of people looking for Cool Sculpting, so you get a lot of these volume. So your initial ROI, if you're even at the very, very low end of $1,250, is $837, and then your full ROI is almost $3,000. Obviously, we have these numbers up here based on our experience and what will happen. This is the sort of the high end, this column, where we see the maximum amount of value of return for your efforts with bringing a patient and selling them maybe on the max of what you could get them for if they want to do multiple sessions or multiple areas, where in the initial is going to be your sort of at least your minimum. So we love to see these numbers because it helps people frame up when they put investments in. So a lot of the times people who ask us who want to get started with this business, the first thing they ask is, how many patients can you deliver? And it's from this math that you can see it's really determined on the budget. So if you want, for example, 10 Botox patients, well, your answer is going to be 113 times 10. If you want 10 Botox and then 10 laser hair, it's 113 plus 170. So you're looking at, this is literally 2,800. So this would $2,800 of marketing on Facebook. So that would bring you 10 of those, each of those patients, and then your yields are here, and somewhere between here and here, depending on how much you end up as an initial ROI or a full average ROI. So let's move down the column here, and I'm going to bring this up because I think it's important. The difference that we have in Facebook and in Google is dramatic. So let's move to Google. Now let's talk about this. So now things change, right? So now we have our cost per lead goes up because we're in a different matrix with more competitors, but our delta comes down. So now our delta, instead of being 1 out of 6.5 patients, is 1 out of 4 patients, because in Google, the patients have got more proclivity to close because they're looking directly for the solution. In Facebook, it's more of a, let's just call it an interruption marketing strategy, where you're interrupting somebody through a feed and you're getting their attention, where this is a direct search. So you're going to come up quite a bit in your delta for your candidacy. The closing rates also go up typically in pay-per-click because your closing rates are going to be a little bit stronger. Not all the time, but in sometimes, because those patients are more apt to want to get it directly and they're coming hot, they're a little bit higher. So we get a higher cost per acquisition in general. Not much, but in this case, significantly enough to change the ROI. But let's talk about what the difference is between a Facebook patient and a pay-per-click patient.
So I think, Matt, you touched on something very important, that the Google patient is someone who is pretty hot. They are searching for the procedure. They tend, based on like the keywords that we're putting into these campaigns, they tend to be bottom of funnel leads. They're not in research mode. So for instance, we're negating keywords such as reviews or complications or before and after pictures, things that people would be searching if they're researching the procedures. We're putting things in like Botox near me, Botox costs, Botox doctors, things that people would be searching for, where they're calling your business and they're saying, I want to make my appointment. I'm ready to have this service. And that's why, number one, the delta is so much higher. And then the closing percentage is also generally a little higher. They're ready to be treated. They're not in research mode. So long as they can afford the service and they're medically a good candidate, they have a very high percentage, in this case, 70%, of moving forward with the procedure.
And another thing to think about, which is a unknown, is the time. So if we go back up here, a Botox patient comes in, 1 out of 6.5 will close. But the question is, how long does it take this person who comes in and costs $113 for an acquisition versus this person who comes in for $170 per acquisition? And the effort involved from the front desk and from the, let's just say, operational field. The interruption marketing is convincing, meaning that you're going to have to think about, you have to convince the person that you are the person, or the practice, the doctor, the MA, the PA, the person that can be trusted with this procedure. In Google, that's a little different of a spectrum, because they're already looking and they've made a decision, right? They're clicking a button to force the issue. So they're not so, let's just say, going to be on the question and answer, version of what we find in this is why people prefer, if they can, to put money in Google, because they don't have to do as much work. They pay more for that, but this difference of, let's say, $50 or so of cost per acquisition is the time it takes to convince this patient, right? So we know that people who run a lot of Google ads versus people who run a lot of Facebook ads, we know the difference, because they know what type of patient that's coming to you will be like. It's different type of spectrum. Now, that's why we usually run both Facebook and Google ads, because each one of these procedures has a different level of, let's just call it, challenge. And when you get to something like fat transfer, right, where we know that the people who are doing fat transfer especially in Google, you're getting a hot patient that shouldn't take too long to convince. Even though the cost per acquisition is $480, the time to get that person over, because they've probably done their research, they've probably done what you'd expect, which is that they've watched a bunch of videos, they've looked around, and then they see an offer. When they finally decide that they want to make that zero moment of truth and click the button to contact you, the chance of this person converting over is going to be pretty good. The return on investment is pretty good. Now, when we look at the same thing for Facebook, we see a different cost per acquisition, because that customer is typically going to be a little bit more, not that they're not inconvincible. They're certainly it's the same customer. It's just they're in a different phase of their decision-making strategy. Not all the time, but most of the time, when you're interrupting someone, it takes a little bit more time as opposed to directly seeing them. And so that's that extra amount of acquisition costs based off of the fact that your funnel there is going to be a little bit further down the pathway in Google. And so that's why we see a lot of the practitioners who are just literally just want to create a machine. They'll run a ton of AdWords because they just don't want to spend the time. They're looking to just get direct drive people right through the door. But we know that we can get low cost leads, and especially for people who are initially starting in this business or are young in the business or have got a good set of staff and be closers, they'll use Facebook at their advantage because they'll be able to get a much better delta of cost per acquisition compared to Google. Any thoughts on that one?
One thing I do want to add that a lot of people really like about Google is that those leads tend to have more of a chance to get into your follow category. So those leads tend to have higher ticket values than the Facebook leads. They're not necessarily searching for the lowest price. Whereas you touched on Facebook ads, we are interrupting the user on the platform. So we have to get their attention generally with a pretty low offer.
Right. Great point. Because this is the one thing that people don't realize that we try and explain to them, which is that when you are talking to a Google lead, the conversation is typically pointed towards getting appointments set directly onto a calendar, meaning they're calling and they're directly asking for a booking, because typically they're not going to be as involved in the sales process as you would be with Facebook, where you're giving them an offer, you're interrupting them, and now they're trying to figure out who is this and why should I go? Where in the case of Google, you're looking at someone who has then clicked on a specific ad and said, okay, I want to do this. So two different types of mentalities, although both are the same at the end. It's literally the same conversation. It's just where they enter the funnel. Now, what's interesting, and I think what most people can see, is that we have some huge numbers here and we have some negative numbers here. And this is the last point I want to make. So the question is, I will bring up hormones because we have a lot of people asking about hormones now. This is a big subject. And I'll start with Facebook. Hormones comes in at a negative 118. And you say, how can this come in? Well, at a negative. So why would anybody do something that's going to cost them money to get them a patient? Well, because we know that if someone comes in on hormones, it's a multi-dimensional challenge and a long-term relationship with multiple involvements. And usually it's a year-long or greater return on investment, because someone who comes in for hormone challenges is usually going to be involved in fixing that process over time. It's not a one and done. And this might involve shots, pellets, diet changes. It could be a multitude of mirrored procedures, which all tend to be together. But what's interesting is that if you're, and we'll just do the numbers here quick in Facebook. So an initial, let's say, consult's $165. Your cost per lead is $25. Your delta's 15%. That's 1 out of 6.5. That puts your cost per booking in 167. Your leads, you close people at 70%. Your cost per acquisition is $283. And you can see your initial ROI goes negative. But what's interesting about this is it's super positive, because we know that there's only going to be maybe 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 that are going to stick at one session. They're all going to come back, and the average is a year and up to $1,500 worth of services, because they are coming in for long-term relationships with that practitioner, which leads itself to also other services. So we know that at the end of the day, this also is a huge cross-sell, because you're now going to go into weight loss. You may be going into other services that the practice provides, and even into the nutritional side, where you can do nutritional support with some of the other elements of what most of these I would say practices want to do, which is they want to get people back into a subscription model where they come back, whether it's product or a multi-threaded conversation around a package. And so that's the last thing I wanted to bring up, which is thinking about packaging services so that you can get to these higher echelon follow-up services or multiple, what I would call wins. And especially when you think about IV therapy, weight loss, hormones, any of the services that we have that are really dedicated towards making sure that our customers, who are our clients, have an idea that when they go to market and they talk to customers, that they are involved in packages when they come out to, let's just say, the first consultation should be around solving it over multiple packages. And I think that that's where, when you start doing package pricing instead of unit pricing, or what I would really say is sort of short selling the practice's ability to solve bigger problems, it really ends up being a much better deal. Can you talk about packaging a little bit, Erica? Because I think this is where you see the critical components of how this is really the business itself in sort of monitoring how we see some of our clients go from really, really initially starting to branch out in their structure to getting to the hundreds of thousands of dollars per month in returning investment from very small spends. And I also want to mention one of the ones I really like, which I know we're not doing specific Facebook and Google cost per acquisition in our, we're not showing the numbers specifically per practice, and we do those quite a bit in the other episodes. But when you talk about IV therapy, especially, when people really could make a huge, huge number, and we're seeing it, especially with BHRT as well, where they're coming on for that initial, for a very short price of it, then they're getting the subscription, and we're starting to see success quite a bit with this. Especially, I think we had one in Florida that's just going nuts right now. Talk about that a little bit, and we'll wrap it up.
Absolutely. So to touch on the hormones, that particular client, they charge the $165 for the first 2 months. That's their hook. That's their offer. And then it actually goes up to $250, I believe, each additional month. So it kind of, if not kind of, it does, it increases as the patient is more comfortable and starting to see results. And that's a great way to do it. The other thing is definitely with packaging some of these other services, like Botox, fillers, cool sculpting, and many of the newer offers that we're actually running tier offers. So it might be claim, 20 units of Botox and get 5 units free. Claim 30 units, get 10 free. We do the same thing with fillers where, 1 syringe is a $50 discount, but, 2 syringes may be $200. And what we find with that is that people get excited. They want to buy the higher package so that they're getting more savings for their money. And then those higher tickets is what is increasing the ROI and making our clients successful. So obviously the average higher the ticket, the more successful you'll be. And that's why having those tier strategies, those packages, ready to explain and sell to your patients is critical to your success.
Right. So you can use this cheat sheet. This link will be in the bottom of this video if you're on one of the social channels, or will be in a link within the content in this piece of material that you are seeing right now. And thank you for watching this. We're super excited. The business itself of this aesthetics world is a $26 billion business. There are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of patients out there looking for you to work with them. This will give you a cheat sheet to see your initial ROIs, your full ROIs, You should be falling somewhere in between the two, and now you can make a better decision on where you want to place your bets on what ads you want to run. Obviously, they all have a different layer of volumetrics, meaning that there's X amount of patients in a given area for each one of these services. But you can bet that the standard services that you see there are extremely active. So if you want to get into this business, now you have a little bit of a cheat sheet about what we're seeing in the market. And of course, we always can help you out with making some decisions. If you need help, certainly contact us. Thank you, Erica. Appreciate this. Great, really good diagnostic, and I hope everybody enjoys the ability to have a download and a takeaway that they can review. We'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.